archaeologist there, all within the Northeast region. But before I retired, I got to do some very, very important and kind of cherry-picked projects. And one of the ones I'm going to talk to you about today is the 2 excavation seasons that we did at Saratoga. So
yeah, the house. Yep.
House here. Okay. Just a couple of housekeeping things to talk about before I actually get into my presentation. If I'm incoherent in my presentation or something doesn't make sense, we have Joel Dukes and I have an article coming out on basically what I'm presenting now. It's coming out in Rich Veit and Matthew Cole's The World Turned Upside Down. It's a volume coming out for in celebration of the 250th of the Declaration. With that, this book will be out, I think, sometime in 2025. So what I'm doing here today is more or less a summary of the chapter that we have in that. The second housekeeping thing I wanted to talk about is ARPA, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, in that the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today was done excavation, metal detectors on National Park Service sites, which according to ARPA, it's against the law, which was a law passed in 1979, to excavate on federal property without a permit. So we have criminal and civil penalties for disobeying that law. So just remember, when you go and visit a National Park Service site, take only pictures and leave only footprints. And we, just to remind everybody of that law. Third thing I wanted to put out there is the use of metal detectors on archaeological sites. And this isn't a completely accepted notion. A lot of people consider these things as kind of the devil's sticks. For the first 10, 15 years of my career with the National Park Service, I viewed them in the same way. But now we're viewing these more as regular geophysical tools, and it's just another archaeological tool in the archaeologist toolbox. And I hope to dissuade anybody in this presentation from thinking that these are nothing but the devil's sticks. I'll show you how we can effectively use these when we go and study battlefields. The fourth thing that I wanted to say, just in terms of housekeeping, is kind of the carnage of war. What I'm going to be talking about is a battlefield scenario. We have a way of sterilizing the results that we have of these battlefield studies. And, we kind of try and make the distribution of musket balls and the distribution of case shots, very sterilized. And it's not. I just want to make sure and remind people that these were wars, these were battles by people who were bound and determined to kill or maim the person on the other side. So when I talk about, these frequencies and the heat maps that show the percentage, realize that there are real people in conflict situations behind all of these. So with that, let's crack open our history books and let's talk and review a little bit about the battles at Saratoga. Now, if you will remember, when we did our Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, that did not go over well with the crown of England. And what happened was the crown and some of the generals got together and were trying to containerize the rebellious New Englanders. And so one of the people that put forward a plan was General John Burgoyne. And he convinced the crown that one of the ways to do this was to have an invasion from Canada. So he and the crown had worked out this, we've got the pointer here. He was going to come down out of Canada along Lake Champlain, along the Hudson River. At the same time, General Barry St. Leger was to come from the west, and they were going to meet in Albany. At that time, the tripartite thing was for William Howe then to come up from New York, and he would also meet them at Albany. But as we all know, plans didn't work out that way. Barry St. Leger, General Barry St. Leger, got hung up at Fort Stanwix, never made it to Albany. William Howe, who was down in New York, turned his attention and went down to Philadelphia and never really assisted. So John Burgoyne, when he set out in June of 1777, you know, he had a few early successes in his route at places like Fort Ticonderoga, but the further south he went, the more headwinds he encountered. And it was clear by the time that he got to Bennington and then to Saratoga that he was facing very stiff headwinds on his plan. Now, there are two battles that were fought at Saratoga. The first was fought on September 19th, 1777. This was known as the Battle for Freeman's Farm. And let's just talk a little bit. There were two battles. The second one was October 7th, 1777. Let's just put those on hold right now, though, and look at the topography out there at Saratoga, because it more or less dictated the terms of the battle. And that Burgoyne was coming down here along the Hudson River. He crossed it from east to west. But can you guys all see this shaded, hill-shaded area here? These are highlands, kind of a plateau that lay above the floodplain. And so he got down here. But before he did that, General Philip Schuyler, who was the main player before Gates became the leader of the Northern Army, basically Schuyler delayed Burgoyne's travels, and that gave time for people like Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who was a Polish engineer, as well as Gates, to fortify the heights. And we're talking about the Bemis Heights down here. When you look at this and the fortifications up there, this is where all of the artillery was placed. And as you can see, it had a great view over the floodplain there. So when Burgoyne came down, he knew that he couldn't just continue on the floodplain of the river, because it would have been like shooting fish in a barrel. In terms of the artillery that was positioned up at the heights, would have just devastated the British Army. So they instead had to take a westerly approach, and that's why you have right out here was the battle for Freeman's Farm, and then later on you have the battle for Bemis Heights. So that just kind of dictates why the British Army didn't come directly down the Hudson, why they had to take a western route, which exposed them a little bit more. Now, in terms of, I know everybody's eyes glaze over when you get to see some of the military maps, but just remember that the British fortified the heights up in this portion of the park, and the Americans fortified the heights down here at this end of the park. Now, they had the battle on September 19th, and it was more or less, it was technically a British victory, but it came at great cost to the British. They had lots of casualties and fatalities from the encounter. But they go back, the armies move back to their respective quarters. The British dig in and fortify two areas, the Balcarres Redoubt, which is right there, and the Bryman Redoubt. Now realize that at this time, the British Army was composed not only of British soldiers, but German soldiers. And the German soldiers primarily were at the Bryman Redoubt. So they go in, hunker down for about 2.5 weeks. And then on October 7th, the British decide to exit their camp, and they're going out to reconnoiter. They're not going out to fight, but in their mind, they're going out to reconnoiter the American left. And so they march their armies out of their encampments there at Bryman and Balcarres Redoubts. They march down in groups or in 3 columns, and they're marching south to try and reconnoiter the American position. What we have here on the right is a battle map drawn by William Wilkinson, or actually it is a later map that was a watercolor map that was used in Burgoyne's defense once he got back to England. But what we have here is a map done around 1779, 1780, but it's based on William Wilkinson's 1777 map that identifies the order of battle for this second battle at Saratoga. And you can see what they did was they came out of their camp, they marched down here, and they decided to set up a line in these 2 empty fields. Now, remember that an army travels on its stomach, and Burgoyne had set out in June, and so this is getting to be October. So basically, the army has eaten just about everything around, and so they're taking this time now. They come upon these 2 open wheat fields, known as the Barber Wheatfields. They decide to collect the grain, and that's kind of why they organize themselves this way. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to point out on this Wilkinson map. And right here is something known in the literature as the Weisserhaus. It was where the British kicked off an American picket that was there. And when they set up their order of battle, they had a little house there and a barn right behind it. Now, let me point out here, because this will be important when I start talking about the analysis later, that the British were the only ones that brought artillery to the site. They came out of their camp, they had 2 howitzers, they had 2 12-pound cannons, and they had 6 6-pound cannons. And so you can see all of these illustrated on this early map. You can see the 12-pound cannons were placed in front of the Weisserhaus here, and here's a 6-pound, couple of 6-pound cannons here, and also a couple over here in the western wheat fields. Now, so the battle lines have been set up there. Now, realize though that they came out only to investigate and reconnoiter the American left, but they set up in battle formation. So if you're the Americans and you see a force of about 1,500 troops coming out and setting up on the battlefield like that, you think there's going to be a fight, there's going to be a battle, which is what the Americans thought of that too. And we know that the British set up out here like this in the late morning of October 7th. It took a little while to get the Americans to mount a counter offensive to this, and we don't know exactly who fired the first shot, but somehow in the afternoon, the battle gets going. and it lasts about an hour. And this portion of the British line is manned by the Germans. The German artillerists were settled in there, and the rest of the line was basically British. But we have the Americans then beginning an attack from the south into this part of the line, which breaks and causes the British to retreat. Daniel Morgan and his riflemen come down along in here and force an evacuation. And they evacuate back to the Balcarres and Bryman redoubts. And there they are overrun by, of all people, Benedict Arnold, and who then forces them to go back to kind of this area and hunker down for the rest of the night. The next day, the British Army retreats about 10 miles to the north to Schuylerville, where they dig in at a place called Victory Woods. And basically they are sieged at that time, and about 10 days later, the British Army, led by John Burgoyne, surrenders to Horatio Gates, who was the American commander. And this is done at a site that was important earlier than that in the French and Indian War, a site called Fort Hardy. That's where they grounded their arms, and that was the first time in history that a British army had been defeated on the battlefield like that. So it was important in that aspect. It was also important in bringing France into the war, who was kind of the sworn enemy of Britain because they had just fought the French and Indian Wars here and the 7 Years' War in Europe, which is what the French and Indian War was known as there. So France comes in our side, takes a couple of years, but we finally win the battle. And so this battle here was the turning point of the revolution. And you'll see it in various history books listed as that. It's known as the Battle of Bemis Heights, but it starts here in the Barber Wheatfields, which is what I'm going to be talking about now. This, of course, is the painting by John Trumbull, done in around 1821. It hangs in the rotunda of the Capitol building. And every now and then when you see the political folks interviewed or something, you see this painting in the background. So that's all that this is. This is General John Burgoyne surrendering to Horatio Gates. And so that's an interesting factoid for you. So how does all of this fit into your archaeology talk? Well, we had several goals when we investigated the Barber Wheatfields. First of all was to verify that this was in fact the site of the battle. We have, as the Park Service interpreted this site as being the site of the Barber Wheatfields, but other than some historical references, we have a grave marker here, or a marker where Simon Fraser, who was one of the British generals, supposedly was shot. But as I was talking with Dick about this earlier, sometimes these are inaccurate and inaccurately placed. So we had this, and we had the good educated guess by the people that set up the park that this was the site of the Barber Wheatfield, but we really didn't have any physical evidence of that. You had people like Dave Starbuck, Dean Snow, do excavations there back in the 70s and 80s, and they had more or less written the whole Barber Wheatfield off. Now, but to their credit, They were looking for traditional archaeological resources, houses, foundations, roads, things like that. The study of battlefields and conflict archaeology was in its infancy at that time. The only reason that we were able to succeed here in this is because it was about 30 years after Doug Scott had done his seminal work on the Battle of Little Bighorn. We had noticed that in the Northeast region, we were able to pick out items on the battlefield using this new methodology that in areas that had been completely disturbed. So Meg Wilkes, her work at Parker's Revenge. I had my kind of conversion experience out at Fort Necessity, where in a heavily disturbed area, we were able to find the French firing line. So one of our goals was then to try and use this technology to verify the site. Second goal was to assess whether or not the battlefield could retain integrity and could tell us anything about the battle. And you can see here on the aerial photo image on the right, this is the Barber Wheatfield, and it had been cultivated for about 150 years before we got out there and did our work. So the area was completely disturbed. If you'll notice that it's devoid of trees or vegetation of almost any kind. So this area had been thoroughly worked over. The third goal for our projects, which were done in 2019 and 2021, 2020, we got wiped out by COVID, as basically did everybody. But we were also under the third goal going to conduct unmanned aerial drones and a geophysical assessment of the battlefield. And we knew at that time for goals 4 and 5, we had a little money set aside for the investigations out there. We knew that we could either have work like that contracted and do maybe a couple of acres, but at that time we kind of wanted to go big or go home. So we could only do that by partnering up with several groups. And as I go through my presentation, you'll see some of these groups that we worked with. But we wanted to build partnerships, and we wanted to make sure that these partnerships could then be utilized in other investigations within the Northeast region. Here's a LiDAR image that we attained using the unmanned aerial drones for the site. This work was only possible because we were using high-end metal detectors. These are on the range of $2,000, $2,500 per unit. These are not the stuff that you go and buy at Walmart that you go and take to the beach. But it was only because we were using sophisticated metal detectors. The GPS, global positioning system, was to such a point that we could get 10 centimeter resolution anywhere on the battlefield. So this helped us in establishing grids, grid corners, proveniencing all the artifacts that came out. And the third component, the reason that we were able to do this, was the development of GIS and being able to dump all of this information into a geographic information system and question the data and do all kinds of plots and things like that. So now let's just talk a little bit about the partners that helped make this project doable. Of course, my old organization, NARP, that's the Northeast Archaeological Resources Program. We provide archaeological services to parks anywhere from Maine down to Virginia. We were kind of leading the effort, but it was done in conjunction with the park, Saratoga and the curator and their resource professionals played such an important part in supporting us, in encouraging us in our work there, that they were also a tremendous partner. We also worked with AVAR, that's the American Veterans Archaeological Recovery. This is a group started by this guy right here, Stephen Humphreys, in about 2016 when he was doing his work, his doctoral work in the UK. And what the goal of AVAR is to use or to teach archaeological skills to combat veterans who have been injured either physically or emotionally during the course of combat, but to teach them archaeological skills as they are reintegrated into society. And we could not think of any people more appropriate to study on our battlefields than veterans. So they played a hugely important part. The AMDA, this is the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeologist. These are professional archaeologists who come from all ranks of contract companies, from government agencies, but who over the last 20 or so years have perfected the study of battlefields using metal detectors. And it's metal detectors are not something that you go and you pick up and you're competent with after using them for an hour. It takes days and days and weeks to build up a competency on this. So we were so fortunate to have their involvement, and they worked with all of the AVAR teams that we had in the field to learn this appropriate methodology. We also partnered with MWAC, this is the Midwest Archaeological Center, who we managed to get out to the site in 2019. They were given a workshop out in New Jersey, but they agreed to come by and help us out. They brought out their mag cart, which is a magnetic sensor, or actually a series of like 19 sensors that they drag along behind an ATV or a UTV, and it works just like a regular magnetometer. But your data acquisition is huge as opposed to getting out and running a regular magnetometer. So they brought this technology. They use their resistivity meters. They use their EM capabilities. So they brought a lot of the geophysics to the project. The American Battlefield Trust. And the trust paid money to offset the travel for the AVAR participants. And they also did a very nice magazine article. They do the Hallowed Ground. They did a whole issue on this project for their fall 2019 edition. So it was nice to have them support us. And also the Northeast Museum Services Center. During the 2019 season, our curator's husband had some serious medical issues, and she could not serve in that role. So the Northeast Museum Services Center stepped in and cataloged all the artifacts from them. So let's talk a little bit about battlefield methodology. We had some, check my time here. Okay. We had some preliminary indications that this would be a ripe site to do metal detecting work because of Section 106 work that Hartgen Archaeological had done around the Stop 5 wayside, because we were having all the waysides and the parking lots redone along the tour road. And so you can see the yellow plots were musket balls that they had unearthed as a result of doing metal detection, which we required under their contract for the work at this stop. So we figured that even though other folks had written it off because they had not found house structures or roads or things like that, it still might produce valuable information for us. So we divided both the eastern and western fields up into 20 by 20 meter units. Okay? This comes from years of doing geophysics, and 20 by 20 meter units are just easy to work in, easy to break a site down into reasonably researchable areas. So within that 20 by 20 meter unit, we identified the 5 by 20 eastern transect as those that we were going to be doing metal detection in. This left 75% of the battlefield untouched and will be available for future exploration. We actually did not even hit that 25% goal because some of the area was wetland, some of the area was heavily vegetated that we could not get to. So in overall, we did about 15 to 18% of the site with this study, and were able to derive the results. The dark blue areas were transects that we investigated in 2019. The lighter blue were transects that we investigated in 2021. So you can see that while we might have been able to get maybe a very small amount of work done if we just contracted this service, we have the in-house expertise. We partnered up with these extraordinary individuals and were able to do all 30 acres of the battlefield for our results. So it was a big bang for your buck, so to speak. And this just represents a plot of all the material that we were able to pull out during the 2 seasons. Here's a view of us working in the western field. A couple of things I wanted to point out. You know, here were the teams of the AVAR and AMDA people working within the transects. We had a full-time person out with a GPS unit recording all of the finds, and everything there got provenience control and went directly into the curation facility where they were properly curated and measured and assessed, and then all that information loaded into the GIS. Now, from that, let's just talk a little bit about the results from this. You realize that 1927 aerial that I showed you guys earlier showed basically plowed fields, right? No vegetation on site, and previous research had failed to locate any of the buildings, and so this area was kind of written off. But once you do all of this work, you metal detect in your transects, you pinpoint and plot everything that comes out. This is what the distribution comes out with for the case shot. And if you remember a little bit a while back, I told you that the British were the only ones to bring artillery to the battle, right? Now they brought cannons that shot regular cannonballs, and these were the 6-pound cannonballs. These were also the 12-pound cannonballs. But also, these cannons shot something called case shot. And this was illustrated down here in this figure. Basically, what you're dealing with is kind of a large tin can that's filled with ferrous round shot. And these are basically anti-personnel devices. They are meant to cut down charging troops. And so you can see from here where the British were concentrating their fire. They were concentrating their fire where the Americans were coming up from the south. This is Learned and Poor's brigades that were charging here. We now think that because of placing the transects the way we did, that the British line in that earlier Wilkinson map was somewhere right along in here. And you can see too that probably where the British cannons were positioned, at least the 12 pounders. And when you are dealing with a cannon shot, basically imagine spray coming out of a spray can, right? You depress the nozzle, some of this stuff drops down, most of it just radiates out in a cone fashion, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at here. And if we go back to kind of the top of the cone, that would have been here. So we believe that the Weisserhaus and the cannons were placed somewhere along in here, and they were concentrating their case shot as the Americans were advancing in this direction. These three pieces of case shot over here are just assumed to be overshot and not really part of the battle. Now let's take a look at musket ball shot. And here again, we recovered many more categories of data, many more artifacts than what I'm going to be talking about here. The two areas that I'm focusing in on here are because my talk is on the battlefield itself. But we recovered domestic items, we recovered agricultural items, we recovered all different kinds of metallic objects, nails. We found out later that a blacksmith had lived on the site. So there were nails and nail fields and nail clouds all over the place. But in terms of the muskets and musket balls, realize that the case shot, the balls were ferrous. When you are dealing with musket shots, you're dealing with lead. So we were able to readily detect these in the field with the metal detectors. And when you look at the information here in terms of small arms musket fire, one thing that becomes completely obvious is that this portion of the western field is way too big, that most of this did not participate in the battle. And so we are encouraging the park to let part of that landscape revegetate because the battle did not happen there. The field would have been much smaller. But when you're looking down here on the eastern battlefield, you can see again that the British were concentrating their fire at this southeastern area of the site, which is where the Americans were storming that British position and ultimately overran the German line. Now, so you say, okay, well, what about the other heat map displays here? What are these two things? I would hypothesize, and here again, this is just my personal hypotheses that we're undergoing assessment on now, is that these were earlier cannon positions of the 6-pounders that were moving across the battlefield. And hear me out, hear my logic on this. If you were trying to take out the cannons, you would want to be shooting at the artillery officers who were manning the cannons. And that's why you have the concentrations there. So that's at least my interpretation of that. But you can clearly see from that last plot of the case shot and this one of the musket fire that most of the battle happened here on the eastern Wheatfield. Now, at the time in 2021, in addition to the metal detection, we went out with this information and tried to locate that all-important Weisserhaus. But we never found the smoking gun on it. We originally started out down here, but came up blank in terms of identifying, the location or any foundations for the house. Then we turned our attention to moving further north because we were finding some of the case shot kind of up in here. So we turned our attention to the north, but we soon learned that this was a early 19th century farm community, one probably just before that 1927 aerial that we showed. So what we're left with is circumstantial information to locate that Weisserhaus. We never found the smoking gun of the foundation. We did find circumstantial things like the nail clouds that you see here. Most of these are nails. We found window glass. We found ceramics. We found some domestic items, i.e. forks and spoons and things like that. So overall, we think it's here, but we never found that specific structure. Here's the group doing some excavation. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that while we worked in conjunction with AVAR, this is the American Veterans Group, they provided a lot of the backbreaking labor for the project. They worked with us on the metal detection, but we did everything we could to supplement their education. We had these lunch and learn activities where every lunchtime we talk about, new technologies. We talk about GIS. We talk about geophysics. We tried our best to educate them to make this a good experience for them as well. So here are some of our excavation units. Down here, this area in one of the units was decaying brick fragments, which is another circumstantial element of a potential house site. But so overall, did we accomplish the 5 goals that we set out to? I think it's pretty clear in terms of the distribution pattern for the case shot and the musket balls that we have verified the site. We can tell the park, or we have told the park, that the western Wheatfield is a little bit too large, and they are considering whether or not to let some of the vegetation grow up. We also found out that even after 150 years of cultivation, the battlefield still has great integrity for this type of research, in that we can understand where the British were concentrating their fire. We can encounter, how the armies and the artillery were moving across the battlefield. We did conduct the UAS and geophysical assessments, and we built lasting partnerships with all those organizations that I talked to you about earlier: AVAR, AMDA, American Battlefield Trust. And for our 5th goal, we have now put this team in place where we have exported this to other sites. We just did a project in July and August out at Minuteman, where we used this same team. We have used the team at Richmond. We used the team at Fort Necessity, Jumonville, Gwen, in 2023. So we have now a team. We have the model put together. We are using this to get more bang for our buck. We've now developed a very good expertise in this. So that's probably all I want to say right now. Mic drop. When you visit national parks, and we do encourage you to get out and visit, take only pictures, leave only footprints. And there's a huge team of people that I can't acknowledge everybody in this, but just know that it kind of takes a village like this to put together a project that is as successful as this one was.
Do you have any questions? Are there any questions?
Yes, please. Distinguish between British musket balls and American, given the fact that the Americans were armed with French charvils and were a smaller diameter than the British ground guns.
We can. The problem there is they were intermixed. You have, while the Americans were using the French weaponry, they also had some of the British mixed in there. And so we can't definitively say things about the small arms fire like we can about the K-shoot, because we know from textual sources that the British were the only ones that brought the artillery. So it's a much more difficult to pick out situation when it comes to the musket balls. But yes, the calibers of the French and American were on the whole smaller than the brown vests that the British were using. Sure. But it's not as easy to tease that out. So.
Did we learn it?
And you do the number of participants on either side?
We know that when Burgoyne was in his camp, he had about 6,000 troops. We know that the Americans started out a little bit more than that, or around that, but they grew. During the 2.5 weeks that the British and Americans set in their camp, more British troops did not arrive, but American troops were being brought up and integrated and joined the force. So the American troops far outnumbered the British by the time of the second battle.
How many American soldiers?
We do, but I'm probably not the best person to answer that. Eric Schnitzer is the park historian, and he's also a military historian and can tell you basically what people ate for breakfast, you know, and who the people were. That's not really my forte. But yeah, the casualty figures and all of that are available.
Great. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.